first I was going to go through and do a little bit of background and then tell you a little bit about contamination and how, not only are these genes pretty horrific, but they also are alive, so they move around in the environment in a pretty scary way. First, we'll look at just a few numbers. This is the percentage of the American crop that was GMO of those categories. So that means almost all of these major crops in the United States was genetically modified. This is last year, except for sugar beets, which had a little bit of an up and a down thing because of the courts. Other crops that are GMO are canola, papaya, zucchini, and yellow squash, and I'll talk a little bit more about those individually. The traits, which have already been talked about a little bit, so 81% of the GMO crops that are grown are the herbicide-resistant, glyphosate-resistant crops that were mentioned. And pretty much the balance of them is the other one that was mentioned, which is the BT, where they're actually breeding a toxin into our food. And then additionally, they're doing what they call stacking genes, which means they'll put several different genes in the same crop, sometimes both of those categories in one crop, to make it more complicated. No GMO crops in commercial production have increased yields or been drought tolerant or raised nutritional superiority, which is those things that we hear a lot from folks at Monsanto. So here's some fact versus fiction. To me, this is really important stuff because, I think the American public is really getting brainwashed right now. I mean, if you watch PBS, Monsanto's very, very slick ads, they come out, and they're really trying very hard to nail us with this over and over and over again. GMOs have higher yields, with the idea we can't not have them because we got to feed the hungry world in the future. That's what they're trying to convince us of. Drought resistance, reduced pesticides. What the science is showing is that GMOs deliver yields that are no better and often worse than conventional crops, which was mentioned. GMO increase chemical inputs, pesticides, herbicides over the long run. No beneficial traits for people. What you notice about their PR message is they're always talking about the future. They're never talking about what's actually happening right now with their crops. And organic and traditional breeding are better at solving future problems. World According to Monsanto, I got to plug that, which I think you can get at Jeffrey's site. It's a great film that reveals a lot of those lies. They call them PR, I call them lies. So higher yields. So the biotechnology industry really wants us to believe that their crops produce higher yields and drought resistance. The Union of Concerned Scientists released a report called Failure to Yield, which analyzed 2 decades worth of peer-reviewed research on the yield of genetically engineered crops in the United States and found that overall they yielded less than GMO crops. And no drought-tolerant varieties of GMOs have been developed yet. Pesticide use, maybe I'll skip through this, but this is some of those facts that we were hearing about Roundup, glyphosate. This is pounds, so it's just showing that, the amount of Roundup that's being sprayed is hugely more since GMOs were introduced. And again, the glyphosate is producing these tolerant crops, so we got to keep putting more and more on it, or stronger herbicides. And BT toxin is bred into all the tissues of our crops now. So to me, that is eating pesticides, as was mentioned. So this is one thing that you also hear where the biotech industry wants us to believe they have the answer for us in terms of crop breeding. And traditional crop breeding has contributed thousands of useful traits over many, many years, all kinds, insect resistance, drought tolerance. We as a country, actually as a race, have this huge history of improving crops, and they're trying to take that from us and act as though they're the ones that are able to fix our crops for the future. So far, GMO technologies have produced only a very few insect and virus-resistant genes and herbicide tolerance for very few crops is really the story. Public breeding successes are never mentioned in biotech advertising, and they'd rather us not know about it. And meanwhile, public plant and animal breeders are working, in relative obscurity, and their funding is being cut because we've created this situation where you have to be a big corporation to have the money to do plant breeding, which is needed. The universities have all had their money taken away from them, either that or they're being funded by the biotech industry, so that the biotech industry gets to set the breeding agenda and tell the universities what plant breeding that they should be doing, which is invariably GMO. Organic versus the genetically engineering study that came out from the United Nations early part of this year that said that small-scale farmers can double food production within 10 years in critical regions by using ecological methods, which basically means organic, small-scale agriculture. So this is the potential that exists, and they're telling us we need them to feed the hungry world, right? So based on an extensive review of the scientific research and literature, this study calls for a fundamental shift toward agroecology, which basically means organic agriculture. You know, it's a pretty dramatic science there that is basically debunking their message, which they put out over and over and over again, which is that we need them to feed the hungry world, etc. It's just not true. You know, this speaks a little bit to consumer trust. So in 36 other countries around the world, including Japan, South Korea, and all of the countries of the European Union, they have significant restrictions on GMOs. So it's really America that is buying lies. Meanwhile, you know, when you talk to people, a lot of people don't even realize that they're eating them, is where we're at in this country at this point. I'll talk a little bit about how contamination happens, and I've kind of picked some crops to illustrate a little bit of how these genes actually move in the environment. So obviously the biotech industry would like us to believe that GMOs don't contaminate other crops significantly. They've put that message out over and over again. Contamination results from pollen drift and can occur over many miles, so pollen hits the wind and can go a long way. Our seed supply is especially vulnerable, so like a lot of people don't realize that seed production is a separate agricultural system really in this country. So that the farmers that are growing seeds, if their crops get contaminated with GMOs, then they sell the seed to even organic farmers. The farmers will plant it out in their fields and GMOs grow. So that's another way that a lot of contamination is happening. In fact, I'll talk a little bit more about the NonGMO Project, but one of the things that we've learned is that this is probably the chief way that contamination is happening right now in this country with food crops. And the good news about that is it's also perhaps the easiest to fix or to prevent. Contamination often occurs in grain storage. GMO bins will just get confused with the non-GMO bins, and then crosses can occur into wild or related species and then replicate for generations. This is the first plant that I'm going to highlight is GMO Bentgrass. The pollen from Bentgrass, engineered to resist Roundup for golf courses and lawns, crossed with wild grass 13 miles away from the test plots. GMO bentgrass has been living in the wild for several years and is prevalent in a strip of Idaho 2 to 3 miles wide and 9 miles long. That's right now. So this is an escape crop that the pollen traveled 13 miles and then has gone wild and is now replicating itself. We're trying to figure out what to do with it. The USDA refused to tell anyone when pressed to by Oregon State University scientists. She actually made it public herself after she went to USDA and asked them to come forward with this. This was going on. Canola is another big GMO crop, and a lot of people know about Percy Schmeiser, who got his fields seem to have gotten contaminated by a truck that drove by, and like some seed just kind of blew into his fields. The Schmeisers were actually sued by Monsanto for them using their GMO seeds that contaminated their field. It's just so outrageous, it's like unbelievable. Corn, the one thing that happened with a variety of corn called Starling wasn't approved for human consumptions, but somehow got into taco shells and a bunch of other corn products in the United States that were eaten by people. 17 people had allergic reactions, actually severe allergic reactions to them. Some farmers said that they sold it as human food in a survey that was done months before the incident. So that just kind of shows how sloppy the whole thing is. Earlier this year, this new high amylase corn got approved, which just adds sort of fuel to the fire, in that it's a variety of corn specifically bred with a protein that breaks down very fast, so that it works very well for making alcohol. And the potential of it getting into the regular corn crop is very real, and could make all our tortillas fall apart pretty soon. Papaya is another interesting story. In 2004, a survey was done of Hawaii's Big Island and found that 50% of the non-GMO plantings contain GMOs. The papaya is very readily crossed, and this shows it was a combination of it got into the seeds, and then the seeds, once planted out, perpetuated it. Tryptophan, you can read Jeffrey's book if you want to know the tryptophan story. This is the first instance where I learned about GMOs, because I was selling tryptophan at Good Earth, and people started to get sick, and it was pulled from the market. Nobody would tell us what was going on. It was only like 3 or 4 years later in Jeffrey's book that the story came out that it had actually been a GMO variety. But this is another place that GMOs occur a lot that people don't generally think about in all these ingredients like citric acid, amino acids, maltodextrin, all these vitamins too are frequently GMO products. Salmon, has the potential of wiping out all our native salmons. 40 generations is what the predictions are if it gets out. So I had to do Jurassic Park too. This is Jeffrey Goldblum, in his character in Jurassic Park says, if there's one thing the history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. So I tell people a lot of times, it's all in Jurassic Park. Eating organic food is still the best way to avoid GMOs, although there is contamination in organic food. It's at this point fairly minor. The organic standards preceded the introduction of GMOs, so for that reason, they weren't really adequately written to cover it, but there is this one clause that says you can't intentionally use GMOs, which is a big protection. So the NonGMO Project is what I've been involved in the last few years, and I believe it's a significant step to help us keep away from GMOs if we want to. And I won't go down the list, but the story is pretty simple. We are basically verifying to a standard that the crop is as GMO-free is possible in this day and age. And once that verification is done, the company can use this logo, and you'll see this logo appear on more and more foods. And when you see it, you know that they have gone through a pretty stringent system to make sure that they're keeping GMOs out of their foods. And you're just starting to see them. And then I also just want to give a pitch for a labeling initiative. I think it's really, really important, partly because if the food is labeled, it creates accountability. And doctors will then be able to ask their patients, was it GMO soy you ate, or was it just soybeans you ate? And at this point, we don't know that. So I'm a real believer that this is needed as labeling of genetically engineered ingredients. It will force big companies. I think it's going to create a situation where a lot of people like Kellogg's is going to just stop doing GMO corn because they don't want to put that statement on the label. So I'm a believer that we need both the labeling of GMO-free and we need labeling of GMOs. I think we're close to being ready to start collecting signatures. This is, to me, a really positive thing. You can go talk to Ann Larry. She can sign you up. There's the website. And that's it for me. Thank you.